Hi, welcome to The Witch in the Woods, and it's Yule again, and it's really, there are so many videos on Yule because we have so much to understand about this Yule festival. We try to mix too many clashing symbols, which leaves many of us scratching our heads, not quite knowing how we should feel at this time of year maybe. So this is something that I'd like to attempt to address in this video, is somehow understanding what the very origins, the far back origins of Yule were, and so applying that to the celebration that we have now and understanding certain aspects of where it came from, which may help us in our celebration and in our spirituality at this time of year. The origin of Yule and Father Christmas owes quite a lot to the legend of the Wild Hunt. And the Wild Hunt is told all over Europe of a spectral vision of ghosts and ghouls who pass across the night sky at Yule, particularly Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. And they are terrifying beings. The leader of the Wild Hunt is said to be Odin himself, although many people call him many other names. To some he is Gwyn ap Nuth, to others he is Herne the Hunter, or even King Arthur. And so he goes by many names, but his legends are quite prevalent. The earliest mention of the Wild Hunt we have is actually in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, and this was written in about 1127, and here we have the recording of having seen the Wild Hunt in Peterborough. Let no one be surprised at what we are about to relate, for it was common gossip up and down the countryside that after February 6, many people both saw and heard a whole pack of huntsmen in full cry. They straddled black horses and black goats, while their hounds were pitch black with staring hideous eyes. This was seen in the very deer park of Peterborough town, and in all the woods stretching from that same spot as far as Stamford. All through the night monks heard them sounding and winding their horns. Reliable witnesses who kept watch in the night declared that there might well have been 20 or even 30 of them in this wild tantivy. The Wild Hunt was compared to the wild storms of winter and the wild blowing winds. It is said that when the Wild Hunt was heard, it portended doom, and people were terrified of seeing, hearing, or being swept away in the Wild Hunt. For this reason they would stay inside, and they would lock and close their doors and avoid being out on the road. The Wild Hunt was a party, it said, of either elves or fairies or the spirits of the dead. The leader of this hunt was said to be Odin, although Grimm traces this tradition further back to the oldest of goddesses, Mother Halder, or Berchta or Perchta as she is also known. He goes by many other names, but quite often it is a male figure, and he rides a horse through the night skies. It was told how witches would join the Wild Hunt, but they would do this while they were sleeping, and their bodies would be lying on their beds at home asleep, but their spirit would be travelling with the Wild Hunt over the skies. This story may be the origin of our stories of witches flying on brooms. The Wild Hunt is a story that is somewhat at odds with Christianity, and therefore may have been changed from something that began as quite benign, changed into something quite terrifying and supernatural and evil. Originally the wild hunt may actually have brought blessings, and these blessings would be the kind of thing like an abundance harvest or luck in hunting. But eventually the story was twisted into the terrifying ghouls of the dead who would steal people away and bring bad omens. The wild hunt was accompanied by fearsome hellhounds, and these were called wished hounds in Devon or Gabriel hounds in the north. In Wales, the King Gwynab Nudd is accompanied by white hounds with blood-red ears. The colour of white and red is quite significant at Christmas and at Yule, and you will see it quite often used in decoration, in adornment, as well as in the colours of Santa's cloak. The white and the red are sacred colours and are associated with the gods and with sacrifice. The origin of Yule is intricately linked to the wild hunt. In Scandinavia, the wild hunt was called the Asgard-ride or the Osterreien, which meant the riding of the gods. So it could be that the beings that we associate with the wild hunt are the gods themselves. In Skarpamal, Odin is called the Yule Father, but the gods themselves are collectively known as the Yule beings. Now this is quite important when we come to look at its origins in far distant north of Lapland, and this is where these stories come from. Many of our traditions of hanging holly up around the house at Christmas owe a lot to this fear of the wild hunt, and so holly was hung up, which would spike evil spirits on its sharp spikes and protect the home, and also other evergreen and protective plants were hung around the house. Holly was hung at all the doors and windows and on the hearth, and this was to avoid the wild hunt or the evil spirits or the souls of the dead from entering the home. These wild animal spirits of the wild hunt may have connections to the Mari-Lwyd in Wales. And the Mari-Lwyd or Mari-Lwyd is a horse's skull on a stick that is paraded from house to house. And it goes around the town on Christmas, and it riddles with occupants to be let into the home. And in your house it will wreak bawdy havoc. The Mari-Lwyd's head on a stick may be connected to the sacred horses that were offered in sacrifice at Yule and at Yule celebrations, particularly in the far north of Norway. Also, there are many other Osses, and these would have heads such as goats and rams and other beings, fertility animals, and these were also paraded around by a geyser who was wrapped in a cloth or a sack and hold the horse's head or the animal's head on a stick. Now these rituals, these ceremonies, were very ancient and very sacred, and often they would enact the killing of this animal and the resurrection of this animal again, so he's killed and then brought back to life. In Eastern Europe, people often dress up as goats, and they are paraded around the streets or through the churches, and as they are taken around, the songs are sung of fertility and harvest and abundance. The young children will reenact spreading wheat and then sing songs of a good and abundant harvest to come. So in Derbyshire here we have the sadly dwindling tradition of Old Tup. An Old Tup is a ram's head on a stick, and it is killed and brought back to life again in a play, and in this play there is always the figure of the devil. And it's thought that the devil in Mama's plays actually represents the old goat god himself. They kill the Derby ram, who is as high as the sky and as plentiful as the universe, and everywhere he puts his foot he covers an acre of ground. And there's so much blood that spills from this animal that it's said that it washed down all the streets of Derby. Not only that, but all the boys of Derby came running for its eyes, and all the girls of Derby wanted its ears. but all the old women of Derby wanted its bones. Now this is very significant. The parts of the animal, the eyes, the ears, the blood and the bones. And this relates to old fertility sacrifices that happened at Yule. So Matt Orrin says of the Yule Gods, Yule and Christmas may relate to an ancient Finnish harvest festival called Kirki, around September and November. The festival was in honour of the god Kirki, who was often depicted as a goat called the Kirkapooki. During this celebration it was customary to throw a feast where everybody would get drunk. A crucial aspect to this feast was to remain standing so that the crops would be bountiful the next year. If people passed out or fell, it would curse the crops to wither or be infertile. A man dressed in horns and fur would aspect the Kirkapooki in a ceremonial parade during the night, going home to ask for and receive alcohol and food offerings. During Kirkapooki the ancestors were honoured, and we see the pagan themes of the mysteries of ale and bread. The cycles of birth, life, death and miraculous transformation. The Kirkapooki would also make requests for women to sit on his lap, most likely a fertility symbolism of the union between deity and humans, and possibly a modern day origins of the sitting on Santa's lap. But before this, before the even the telling of the Anglo-Saxon vision of the wild hunt, we can be fairly sure that the Sami were telling these tales of being similar to the wild hunt up in the far north of Arctic Norway, and that this was possibly the origin that had come down to us through the Anglo-Saxons and later the Vikings. The Sami and the Laplanders were considered extremely magical, and they practiced an animistic and shamanic religion and ritual. They did this well even into the 17th century, and there is a book called Lapponia by Johannes Gerhard Schaefer, which was written in 1673, and it covers the rituals and ceremonies and beliefs of the Laplanders well into the 17th century. It would seem that they would honour both the Christian church and their own gods side by side, and it was said that as they were so reliant on the gods of their own for hunting and fishing, for their clothes and for their survival, that they honoured these gods highest of all. So their practice and their religion continued and were recorded in 1673. So this book, Lapponia, tells how there were three main important gods to the Sami, the Laplanders as he calls them, and these were mainly Thor, and they considered Thor the supreme being, the most powerful being, and he was a benefactor. Now he is later known as, or became, Odin, but let us remember that before anybody else the Laplanders worshipped Thor. And then secondly they worshipped a god who they called Storjunkare, and he was an extremely important character too. And then below these two gods they recognised the sun of being of extreme importance. The sun was known to fatten the beasts and give them health and well-being, and for this reason they thought that she was worthy of honour too, and so they worshipped these three main gods. Now below these ranks of gods there were two other categories, and these were the Manes and the Juhlian Company, and these were thought to be lesser spirits. They were the spirits of the ancestors. They were the souls of the dead. The Manes were the more familiar ancestors, perhaps of the direct family line. And then behind there was the host of general dead, and these were called the Juhlian Company. Now they classed these two classes of spirits together, and collectively they called them Sitte. So there was not a lot of differentiation to be found amongst them. The first god was Thor, and they called him Tyrmes. And in their language, Tyrmes meant anything that made a loud sound, and it signified power to them. So the Laplanders believed that Thor had the power to destroy trolls, and of this Schaefer said, "They verily believe that this Thor, whom they call a Yake or Tyrmes, has the disposition over men's life and death, health and sickness. Besides which they attribute to him the command over all the demons, dwelling among the rocks, mountains and lakes, whom he chastises, keeps in awe, and sometimes destroys with his thunderbolts. It is their opinion," says the before-mentioned author, "that the thunder destroys all the evil demons, which is the reason why they give Thor or Tyrmes a bow and arrow to shoot the demons with, and this bow, they say, is the rainbow. They style the rainbow the bow of Thor, wherewith he shoots at and kills the evil demons who come to hurt them. 'Tis true they don't call it thus in their own, but in the Swedish tongue, for the Laplanders term it Aike Dharma, the grandfather's bow, intimating thereby that God will, like a kind father, protect his offspring against the evil demons. Wherefore they also give him a mallet, which they call Aike Witchera, to dash out the brains of those demons." So Thor has the power to destroy evil demons in their lives, and for this they give him the attributes of a bow and arrow or of a hammer. The second god they call Storjunkare, and he is seen as a kind figure. He is like the lieutenant of Thor. He bestows the blessings upon the people from Thor, and he is the depository of all the souls of all the wild animals. He is in fact the lord of the wild animals, and they call him the vicegerent of gods. Vicegerent because they are beholden to him for all their blessings that they receive. Schaefer says of him, "He is a vicegerent of God, the absolute disposal of all sorts of beasts, viz. Bears, wolves, foxes, reindeer, fishes and fowl, which cannot be taken without his blessing." So people often told of having met Storjunkare, and it was said that they'd met him carrying a gun, and he was like a normal huntsman except that he had the feet of a bird. And it's said that he often shot birds and would give it to them as gifts, and this was seen as quite a blessing from the god himself. And where they'd seen this Storjunkare, that was considered to be the place where they worshipped him. The third deity was the sun, and she had no image. And the reason being for this is that she was seen daily by all, so they did not need an image to represent her, but she did receive sacrifices. So it's said that they worshipped Thor on a platform, a scaffold, which was a short distance from their huts. And this platform was made of boards, but instead of an altar, they placed behind this platform birch branches, and they placed them so as to form a sort of a fence. And it was on this place that they worshipped Thor. Now Schaefer tells how Samuel Reen also says that these branches at the back of the platform were also pine. So birch and pine were particularly significant, and it could have been both these woods at certain times of year. So it's said that at these places they erected a birch tree to Thor. And the birch tree would be inverted, and the roots would be the hair of Thor, and the trunk the body, and they placed this in the ground. Sometimes it wasn't always very obvious that it was an icon, a symbol. Sometimes it just looked like a stump of wood, and it was a stump of wood, it was always wood, by which they would represent Thor. Now to this idol they would give a hammer, and this would be symbolic of his attributes of strength. It was said that sometimes they would drive a nail into the head of the idol, an iron nail, and a small piece of flint, so that the god could strike a fire with the flint and the iron. Storjunkare, on the other hand, was worshipped at rocks, and mainly this was places where people thought they had met or seen him as a spectral figure, as a ghostly figure. So he was worshipped quite a lot on mountains and in certain piles of rocks, also in boggy places and by lakes. And the idol for which they chose for Storjunkare was a rock in which they could see the aspect of the god in that rock. Now it had to be a very secret figure that only appeared to a certain person. In fact, it's said that no amount of explaining it to anyone else would ever make them see that figure in the rocks, and these were sacred to Storjunkare. They also called whole boulders of rocks the rocks of Storjunkare, and he was seen as being sacred here too. So anywhere where there were gatherings of rocks on a mountain or a particular rock itself. So whole mountains were sacred to Storjunkare, and these were called a particular name, and these were the Pasiwara, the sacred mountains. And so there were many of these named that were sacred mountains, it was forbidden for women to go there. The women were considered to be of ill luck, and the reason for this being that they could be menstruating at any time, and so this was taboo, this was considered impure. Because of these superstitions, it was also unlucky for a wife to follow a hunter out of the same door when he went on a hunt. So there were certain taboos against women following the men, using the same door, or entering any of these sacred places. So Storjunkare was seen as collections of stones, and these stones together were called the sleigh. And they were like stone beings, sacred stone areas. There was also the god called Kidki Yumal, and he was the stone god. So the sleigh have no shape or form, but can be seen as common stones, like black, ugly, dirty old stones full of holes and rocks and pits. But it was said that they were especially darkened by people rubbing the fat and blood of an animal on the stones, which had stained them a dirty, dark, unappealing black colour. Schaefer says, near that place where the river Termatrask sends forth a branch, making an island, is a cataract called Dara. In the middle of that island are certain sleigh of stone, of a humane shape, set up in good order. First one high as a tall man, next to him are four more, but somewhat shorter, having altogether a kind of hats on their heads. They don't always set up one stone, but increase their number as according they find more or less. The first they give the title of Storjunkare, the second is styled his spouse, thirdly comes his son or daughter, and last all of his men and maidservants. They did this because it was said they didn't want to see their own highest valued god, Storjunkare, have any less of a retinue than any of the lords or ladies or landed gentry thereabouts. So at these places, how they worshipped the gods was at first they would make a divination to see if it was welcome to the gods that they made a sacrifice there. And they did this by placing a ring on a drum, and then they would enchant the drum and beat the drum and bounce the ring around to see whether they could divine from the signs whether it was acceptable to the god to perform a sacrifice. They would beat on the drum and sing some songs, The drum was a Kannus, a Lapland drum as it was known, and the ring, it was said, was of a brazen fox on an iron ring, or else a bunch of circular rings, which bounced and rattled on the drum. The sacrifice is offered to Storjunkare by the ring landing on his figure or by some other sign. Then it is known if the sacrifice is accepted. Next, the beasts they would sacrifice were also defined using the ring and the drum. The drum was painted with various animals, and the animals the ring fell on were then promised in sacrifice. Most sacrifices were of reindeer, but they also sacrificed any other animals that were readily available. If the ring stands on the image of Storjunkare, then the sacrifice is accepted. But if it is not accepted by him, the sacrifice is then offered to Thor in the same manner by beating a drum and seeing which way the ring goes. At the same time that they offered these sacrifices to Storjunkare, they also set up a new idol of Thor. So they would consecrate it with certain ceremonies, which was a sacrifice and an anointing of the idol with the blood and fat of the sacrificed animal. So they would take out the bones and smear the blood and the fat on the idol, and then they would bury the flesh and the bones under the ground, and they did this to sanctify the new idol. So this was done yearly. They would also put on the scaffold behind the idol the horns and skull of the sacrificed animal, and also its hooves and skin. Then they would bury its bones beneath the idol. Before the idol they also placed a birch bark box, and they placed within this box a part of every member of the reindeer and some blood and some fat. So they offered similar sacrifices to Storjunkare, but these were performed twice a year, and it would seem that these were performed at midsummer and midwinter. And to do this, they would dress the stone with birch branches or grass or pine branches, and they laid these around the stones, and this was to sanctify the stones and to reconsecrate the images twice a year. Now, as they did this twice a year, in the summer it would be birch branches, and in winter it would be pine branches, and this was performed at the dead of winter. Now they sacrificed for Storjunkare a reindeer, and this reindeer had a red thread tied to its ear, and he had to be a male beast, a particularly virulent, strong male beast, and as part of his virility it was said that his private members were hung on his right antler, and on his left antler was tied a red thread, as well as the red thread through its ear. So this red thread on his antler was coated with tin and a little bit of silver. And they would place these skulls on the fences around the stone. In fact, they placed so many skulls around that it would form a fence, and this was called the Yule Gods, which meant a fence of horns, or the enclosure surrounded by horns. Then they would have what they would call Storjunkare's feast, where they would feast on all the flesh of the sacrificed animal, but they would make offering of leaving the skin behind. If they could not reach the stones that were sacred to them, particularly if it was high up on a mountain or something, they would have the feast and then dip a stone in the blood of the animal and throw it up towards the rocks where they had seen the vision of Storjunkare, but perhaps could not access themselves. Now they would know if Storjunkare had accepted the sacrifice by the way in which they laid boughs of birch or pine around the stones. It's said that if the branches felt particularly light, then the acceptance of that sacrifice was bestowed and there was good luck and good beneficence. It was said that if the straw felt particularly heavy, then it was unlucky they had angered the god Storjunkare, and it would be propitious to give him sacrifices to avert any bad luck or to avert his anger. So the sun was also sacrificed to. And to the sun they would only ever sacrifice female reindeer. It was either female reindeer or very young prepubescent animals, very young animals. And to this sacrifice they would put a white thread through the right ear of the reindeer. So they tied a thread of wool to the right ear and made a garland of willow and attached pieces of the flesh of every part of the reindeer onto the willow hoop. Then they would leave this on a separate scaffold just for the sun that they had placed a small way from their huts. It said of this scaffold that it had no idol on it, other than being in a circular shape, almost like a wreath of bones as a scaffold. Other than that, the sun had no image. So these were the sacrifices they made to the gods, the main gods, but they also made sacrifices to the Manes and to the Juhlian feast. So the Juhlian Company were the fourth type of spirits, and these were called the Juhlafolket. And the way that they were honoured, they had no images either, but they were honoured at a tree a short way from their home, and they would hang up in the tree an offering to the Juhlafolket, who were quite feared because they were thought to be abroad in the forests and in the mountains, particularly on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. So these were the souls of the dead who were lesser beings but were still offered a sacrifice. Again, a drum is asked whether it is acceptable to the gods, to the Juhlafolket, to accept their sacrifice, and again to divine what kind of sacrifice they should be promised. The sacrifice that they would be offered would be to fast from meat on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. Now on those days they would feast abundantly on everything else that was on offer, they would just not eat any meat. Of everything they ate, they kept a small portion and they put it aside, and the offerings from these 2 days of feasting they would put in a birch bark sailed boat, and this boat would have sails, it would have oars, and they had no explanation for why they had chosen a boat. The writer attributes this to being some kind of Christian influence, but it's recorded that they could not tell you specifically why they had chosen the symbol of a birch bark boat. Now onto this boat they poured a broth of animal fat, and then they hung it on the tree, and this was to appease the spirits that would be abroad on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. And these we know as the wild hunt, as the Yule folk, the Juhlafolket. They are the lesser spirits, but still recognised and respected and offered sacrifice. So now we know Odin as the leader of this wild hunt, this wild cohort of spirits and ghouls that run abroad. So he's been known by many other names, such as the leader of the wild hunt in Wales is Gwynapnuth, and he has a pack of hunting hounds who are white hounds with blood red ears. The white and the red are specific to the male sacrifice and the female sacrifice that may have originated in Lapland. Now in Scandinavia it is only the barking of dogs that is heard to portend the arrival of the wild hunt. They are very rarely seen, and it is the sound of hoofbeats and the barking of dogs who portend that they are about to arrive. It's said that if they arrive, they may bring ill news, such as the beginning of a war starting. It could also portend the changing of a season, so be prepared for a particular change in weather. So whatever way we choose to reenact this ritual or take this ritual into our psyches, it kind of speaks to us of our own wild side, of joining our own cohort of dead and honoured ancestors at this time of year, bearing in mind that witches were said to join this hunt in the hours of sleep. We can embrace this wild hunt and celebrate those souls of ancestors and dead. In old times before Christianity, they brought blessings. They brought the blessings of a new year and of fresh hunting and the rebirth of those animals that had been killed into an abundant new harvest. So it would seem the origin of Christmas is indeed in Lapland, and maybe the original rituals of sacrifice and ceremony performed by offering sacred reindeers, the horns and the skulls of reindeers to the gods, to ask them to continue their blessings upon the hunt, for which people once were very dependent for their food, their clothing and their survival. Later the beings of Yule were called the Oss, the Aesir, the gods, and this is why when we see the mummers' plays reenacted at this time of year, the old Oss may not be a horse's stick so much as it represents Oss as God, the gods themselves, the old Oss or the old Aesir. So Yule is as ancient as the old gods themselves, in fact as ancient as the ancestral hunting grounds. We know the figure as Odin, but he is often portrayed as a horned god. He's named as Hern, he's named as Kannus, he's named as Gwynapnuth. He is the stag god. He is also the change of season from the holly god to the oak king. He goes by many guises and he has many different stories attached, but it was always sacred to leave offerings at this time and to remember those spirits of the dead. So thank you for listening, and I hope you got something from this, and I wish you all a very merry Yule, and I hope to speak to you all again soon. Cheers, bye.